Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the final installment of the Climate Justice Summer School webinar series. Today, we're going to be covering climate finance with two of our favorite guests here from ActionAid, Brendan Wu from ActionAid US, and Pontus, a former, the person who wrote our climate finance report for ActionAid Netherlands in the last couple of months, currently works for SIDA, but was thankfully open to helping us out with this webinar here today. I want to ask Brendan and Pontus to introduce themselves to everyone for a quick second. Brendan, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me to ActionAid Netherlands and to Niels. My name is Brendan Wu. I'm the Director of Policy and Campaigns for ActionAid USA. And a lot of my work has been focused on climate justice and climate finance more specifically over the last 10 years or so. I was the elected developed country representative on the Green Climate Fund board from 2013 to 2015 and have done quite a bit of advocacy and lobbying on finance issues at the UN climate negotiations as well.
Welcome, Brendan. And Pontus, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, good evening. Hello, everyone. And thanks so much, Niels, for inviting me back to present our work on climate finance. My name is Pontus Korsgren, and I currently work as a program specialist on social protection for the Swedish development agency, SIDA. But before joining SIDA, I had the privilege to support Niels with different tasks under the climate justice work at ActionAid Netherlands. And we particularly wrote this report on climate finance and just transition that I will be presenting today.
Thank you very much. Well, you guys are going to have a fairly straightforward time here today. We're going to have Brendan present, mostly focused on the global issues, looking at where climate finance came from, what it really means, and those kinds of elements. And then we're going to dive into a bit of a case study with Pontus. I just want to remind everyone the question and answer section is open. After each presenter, we're going to do a quick clarifying round. So any questions that come in that I feel are shorter answers, I'm going to make sure that those get attention quite quickly. Anything longer, we're going to put into the longer question and answer section near the end, more of a discussion area. And if you have any questions that you want to come in on, and you'd like to have a quicker back and forth with presenters, just send me a message in the chat, and then we can maybe let you or give you the rights to also speak quite quickly, where you can ask a question and maybe have a bit of a follow-up here and there. But just make sure to let me know, send me a message, or make sure you pose it in the question and answer section. We'll make sure that we get to everything before the end of this, and we'll be ending everything at 8:30 our time. So that's about an hour and 25 minutes from now. And if we end a little bit earlier, then that's also fine. But just so everyone knows when we'll be cutting it off. Without any further ado, then I think I'll hand it over to Brendan and let him get things started.
Great. Thanks, Niels. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a little presentation that I'm going to use. So let me do that now. So I am going to cover a lot, I think, in the next half hour, or hopefully a little bit less. I'm happy to be interrupted by clarifying questions. So if you want to drop those in the Q&A or the chat, and then maybe Niels, you can interrupt me if there's something I've said that's just completely unclear to people. That would be totally fine.
Will do.
So I'm going to give basically just an overview of the issue. So starting from the very basics, what is climate finance? What are we talking about? How is it distributed? Through what institutions? How much finance should different countries be contributing? Which I think is a key, largely unresolved, unaddressed question, at least in official channels and in the UN negotiations, for example. And then what are some of the key policy and political debates around climate finance right now that may be addressed at the UN level or within national governments? And that will be a sort of bridge to the things that I think Pontus is going to be speaking about as well. So that's the overview. So just jumping right into it, what is climate finance? The simplest, I think, explanation is that it's financial support for developing countries to fund climate action. Now, in the UN climate negotiations, there's sort of three main buckets of climate action. You see them on your screen there: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Hopefully you're all familiar with those terms. Mitigation, of course, is actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation is supporting communities to adapt to climate impacts or prepare for climate impacts. And then loss and damage is a somewhat newer term, and that refers to supporting communities after they have experienced severe climate impacts that were too severe to be adapted to properly. So the kind of classic example is the impact of sea level rise on coastal communities or small island states. People living in those areas need to be supported in a way that goes beyond adaptation measures, right? They may have to move their entire livelihoods. Sometimes humanitarian response to really big and severe storms is another example of what might be categorized as loss and damage. And there are both economic and non-economic, like cultural losses that are associated with these sorts of events. Again, this is a relatively new aspect of the climate parlance in the United Nations, but a real recognition, especially in developing countries that are already being heavily impacted, that there is a need for finance to support communities dealing with loss and damage. And I think importantly, the second point that you see on your screen, we don't think about finance as charity. We think about it as a responsibility. You may have heard the term climate debt. We believe that wealthier countries who are responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, who have really played a lead role in causing climate change, have a responsibility for supporting countries and people who had little to do with causing the problem, yet are feeling the impacts the worst. So climate finance, I think it's important to play on that legal aspect. Climate finance is not just something that we in the NGO world have dreamed up of. It's a recognized aspect of the international climate regime. Governments have taken on concrete commitments around climate finance. They understand that this is important. And when I say here that it's a cornerstone of the international negotiations, there's sort of two aspects to that. One is purely practical. Without climate finance, developing countries simply don't have the resources to tackle the climate crisis. And the other is political, which is that without climate finance, there is no reason for some countries to play along in the UN climate negotiations, because in a lot of developing countries, the climate crisis is one of many challenges that are being faced. There are development challenges, there are poverty challenges, and under our current economic system, often the way out of development challenges is through a fossil fuel intensive economic growth strategy. And if that is the cheapest option that's available to developing countries, then it makes sense that they would take it, absent international support through climate finance, through technology transfer, et cetera, through the UN climate regime. And so there's both a political and a pragmatic reason that climate finance is absolutely key for progress in global climate action. And recognizing that, over 10 years ago, wealthy countries said, okay, we're going to mobilize $100 billion a year in climate finance by 2020. In 2015, when the Paris Agreement on climate change was agreed, hopefully you all are familiar with that. It's almost all countries in the world are signed up to the Paris Agreement, which is a voluntary framework for countries to act on climate, and there is a financial component to that. The wealthy countries reaffirmed their $100 billion pledge. Unfortunately, it is, of course, now 2021. $100 billion per year has not materialized. Developed countries are way behind on meeting this pledge. And also importantly, that's an arbitrary figure. It doesn't represent what's actually needed. For mitigation alone, hundreds of billions of dollars, multiple hundreds are needed in the developing world. The UN has estimated that up to $300 billion per year will be needed for adaptation in developing countries by 2030. And so not only is the 100 billion figure not being met, it's also not enough. And so a lot of what we as civil society have been working on is pressuring rich countries to find that money and to increase their ambition and increase the targets for the amount of money that we can provide. So the money that is being provided, and there is some, it's not 100% bleak, is distributed to developing countries through a variety of channels. Now, the biggest one, the one that has gotten the most attention in the climate world, is the Green Climate Fund, which is currently about a $20 billion fund. Again, that's $20 billion total, not per year. And so you compare that to the figures that we were just talking about, and you can see how far we have to go. There are a number of other funds, like the Adaptation Fund is a relatively small fund that's focused just on adaptation. Importantly, there are not any funds dedicated to loss and damage, and there is no agreement in the UN climate negotiations yet about how to deal with finance-related needs associated with loss and damage. And that's something that wealthy countries, particularly the United States, but also many others, have been extremely unhelpful on. They've been blocking progress on that aspect of negotiations for years because they don't want to be on the hook for providing loss and damage finance. I'll talk a little bit about why these different institutions are important a little bit later in the presentation and what differentiates them a little bit. And I think Pontus will go into a bit of this as well, because it's actually, this is not just a matter of, okay, a national government comes up with a few $1 billion and we give it to developing countries, and then they know exactly what to do with it, and they can make all the decisions about how to spend the money. Unfortunately, that is not how things work. And in many cases, we're still driven by this sort of top-down, donor-driven model where a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. has more control over how money is spent in, say, Bangladesh than a local government who is actually dealing with the impacts has. And some of the institutions that have been set up, like the Green Climate Fund, try to improve on those governance mechanisms to make sure the money is going where it needs to go. There are challenges there, and that's something that I'll speak to a little bit more later on in the presentation. So I want to spend some time addressing this question of how much do different countries owe, essentially, because, and the reason that this is important is because when we do advocacy around climate finance at the UN level, and we're talking about these big targets, $100 billion a year by 2020 or what have you, at the end of the day, nothing actually gets implemented at that level. What matters is the policies that national governments set, the budgets that national governments create, et cetera. And so what is actually more helpful to know than a 100 billion target way out there is, okay, well, what does the Netherlands actually need to do? How much does the government need to budget? How much does the US government need to budget for international climate finance? And in order to answer that question in a way that that is actually fair, so that a country like the Netherlands isn't budgeting more money than the United States, which I think would obviously be unfair, we developed a methodology, which we refer to as a fair shares methodology. And this goes beyond finance. It goes to actually all of climate action, including greenhouse gas emissions. It was actually the primary focus of this. What are fair shares of different countries' emissions reductions? And the way that we think about this is we have an emissions pathway. And so the black line that you see on top is essentially global emissions in the absence of significant climate action. The blue line is what emissions need to do under a scenario in which we actually keep to no more than 1.5 degrees global temperature rise by 2030, which of course is the goal, right? Keeping temperature rise under 1.5 degrees. And the shaded area is the emissions that need to be avoided in order to keep to that scenario. Now, the question that we're trying to answer with the fair shares analysis is, how do you split up that shaded area, that 36 gigatons of total emissions reductions or avoidance? How do you split that up among countries or regions? And this is, one possible answer to that. So you see the United States has a quite large responsibility, the EU also as well. China has a significant responsibility, although it's less than the US and the EU. And then India, which we talk about a lot, has actually a fairly small responsibility for reducing emissions. And I'll get into the why of all this next, actually. But this is the problem that we're trying to solve. And now the question is, how do we get to the sizes of those different colored bands? So we basically have two main indicators that we use to determine the size of a country's band. And those are responsibility and capacity. Responsibility is essentially, what is your responsibility for causing climate change? And the thing about that is that it's easily quantifiable. We look at greenhouse gas emissions that any given country has put into the atmosphere. And the sort of ethical question here is, how far back do you count emissions? Do you only count them since the time when humans were aware of climate change as a problem, say 1950? Or do you count them since the Industrial Revolution, when emissions actually began in earnest? And there's a real political impact behind this consideration, because the further back you go, the more responsibility lands on the industrialized countries in the global north, right? Whereas if you were only starting to count emissions starting in 1950 or even 1990, which some have proposed in the UN, then all of a sudden the role of China and many of the economies that have been growing very quickly in Asia and Latin America and Africa, those become much more important relative to the global north if you take the start date at 1950 or 1990. ActionAid as an organization, we believe that 1850 is the ethically appropriate start date, but there are reasonable arguments for 1850 and 1950. The second principle turns out to be much more important, actually, compared to responsibility in terms of what it does to the outcome of the fair shares calculation. And that's capacity. That is, how much wealth does a country have to actually implement climate action? What are its resources that it can put to bear to this problem? And importantly, we use GDP as our proxy for national wealth, but we didn't want to count all dollars or euros or pounds the same, because in many places there's a large proportion of the population where the GDP that those people are creating, as it were, it is really a baseline level of expenditure needed to live, right, to meet basic needs. And so we didn't want to count the income of people living at a poverty line as part of a country's climate action, right? And so we set a threshold level under which, we're not counting a certain any income under a certain threshold level, which could be a poverty line, it could be a $20 a day line, something like that. And then we also set a luxury threshold. So income of the super rich should actually be counted extra, because that is the kind of money that we should be going after in terms of progressive taxation or something like that, to leverage resources to deal with climate change. And this capacity calculation actually weighs extremely heavily in our results of what countries' fair shares should be. And then just as a note, we weight those things equally. In our calculation, we did 50-50 responsibility and capacity. And all this is fairly technical. It's a purely quantitative methodology, and I'm happy to answer questions about it in the Q&A, but I think the important thing to take away is that these two principles, responsibility and capacity, are the basic indicators we use, and they correspond to basic moral and ethical principles, right? So responsibility, if you made the mess, you should clean it up. Capacity, if you are much wealthier than your neighbor, you have a correspondingly larger obligation to the public good, right? They're pretty basic and universal principles. Now, what we can do with this is come up with a fair share for every country. And I apologize for using the US as an example. This is just coming from my context. And so we've done all this work, and we came up with a fair share calculation for the United States, which is that, this graph you see here is similar to the first graph I showed. The top line is US emissions without climate action. And then the blue line is where we need to be in a 1.5 degree scenario where we're doing our fair share. Now, the problem with this is it goes below zero. And this is true if you made this graph for any developed country in the global north, that blue line would go well below zero. What we're not saying is that these countries should be implementing geoengineering or massive negative emissions technologies to actually suck greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, because I think, as you've talked about on a previous webinar, those are very dangerous, unproven technologies. And so how do you actually achieve this when, the best that we can do in the United States, we think, is probably about a 70% reduction in emissions by 2030. And that's a political calculation. Scientifically, we could do better than that, but politically, that's probably the best that our coalition thought we could expect. So that leaves this whole blue area unaccounted for. And the solution is through climate finance. So this is how finally we're getting back to the finance question. We can meet our fair share as the United States by doing the red part, which is as much emissions reductions at home as possible. The rest of it in blue, we achieve by providing finance to developing countries so that they can reduce their emissions faster than they otherwise could and beyond their own fair shares. So all of that blue area is essentially the United States provides money to the rest of the world to reduce their own emissions, and that comes on top of this red area. So it's not an offset, right? We are not paying other countries to reduce their emissions so that we can continue business as usual. We're doing both. And then you can put some numbers to it, right? So you can see that this here, basically this is 70% reductions at home, and then the equivalent of 125% reductions internationally, which is 9 billion metric tons. Sorry, metric tons is a US is a US thing. That's 9 billion tons of reductions abroad. And so then the sort of logical question is, okay, well, what does that mean in dollars or euros? How much money is that 9 billion metric tons? This is where things get a little complicated. There are many existing ways to calculate the cost of emission reductions. And as you can see from this chart, they will vary wildly, by an order of magnitude. And so when we ran this fair shares project for the United States, the end product of it was an advocacy document where we said to the US government, this is your fair share, and this is what you need to commit to when you, the Biden administration in this case, when you rejoin the Paris Agreement. You need to submit a US target, and it needs to be aligned with this fair shares model. And we also put in dollar figures. We said, and you need to commit to this amount of climate finance every year in order for us to meet our fair share and for the world to have any chance at keeping to 1.5 degrees. Now, the problem is that if you look at these numbers, there's no accepted methodology for converting a mitigation outcome to dollars. And so what we did was we sort of used a low figure, but still one that we were somewhat comfortable with ethically, and said this is a down payment. So we came up with $800 billion from now until 2030 should be the US fair share of climate finance. understanding that the actual costs might be much, much higher depending on which of these methodologies are correct, and accounting for adaptation and loss and damage finance, which is not included in these numbers. And so we said we need to evenly split finance between mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, because both politically and practically, those are equally, they're all extremely important. We can't afford to lowball any of them. And to date, adaptation and loss and damage have gotten short shrift. So we need to turn that around. We need to finance them all evenly, split $800 billion between them. And that's just a down payment. That's just the beginning. There's probably much more that's going to be needed, but that would communicate to the world that we're serious and that we're taking the problem seriously. Okay. I apologize for the sort of deep and methodological dive, but I think what I wanted to illustrate was that it's not easy coming up with the top line targets. It's not easy coming up with, it's not easy to know how much is needed, first of all. We know that the numbers are enormous. We know that we're not getting anywhere close. But we need to have a good sense of what we should be demanding from our governments, right? And so the US example is sort of how we chose to do it this year. And of course, it has not resulted in the US committing to $800 billion by 2030. Instead, what we got was a little under $6 billion by 2024, which is pathetic, to be frank. And it's about what the US Department of Defense spends in 3 days, to put in context what is being offered on the table right now. So that gets to this first key issue right now, which is how much money is actually moving from wealthy countries to poorer countries. And the answer is not nearly enough. And that is a key aspect of our advocacy, is just getting more money out the door. Now, the next bullet on accounting issues speaks to how many of the wealthy countries are pretending that there's more money flowing than there actually is. And so additionality is basically, is this actually new money for climate finance, or is this existing foreign assistance or development assistance that there is a climate component to it? And so now you're saying, oh, this is our climate finance contribution. It has long been a demand of civil society that climate finance come on top of existing development finance, and that we not take away from existing and much needed foreign assistance in order to provide climate finance. It has to be on top of that. The next thing is are we only counting public money, or is there some magical leverage figure that governments are using to say, well, we gave $10 billion to this project, but $50 billion of private investment resulted from that. And so what our real contribution was $60 billion, not 10. This is a real contentious issue, and one that we've been very adamant on, that there has to be a focus on public finance. I think Pontus is going to speak a little bit to this as well. But one of the main reasons for this is that private investment does not typically reach the most vulnerable. And it does not typically go to things like adaptation projects where there's not really a return on investment that can be expected. And then the other big one is, are we talking about grant-based finance, or are we talking about loans? Where, for example, a country might give $50 million, but there's a massive interest rate tacked onto that, or even if it's not a massive interest rate, even if it's a concessional interest rate, they may be counting the face value of the loan as part of their climate finance contribution, rather than just the grant element, which is the money that is the net transfer between countries. And we're very clear that it's the net transfer that counts. So these are different ways that wealthy country governments have sort of obscured and inflated the amount of finance that's flowing that we need to be aware of as a community, because what matters is, how much money is actually moving to implement climate action in a way that is just and sustainable. Governance is the next thing that goes along with that. And I referred to this earlier. Who decides? Who gets to decide how the money is used? in traditional development finance, it's often very top-down, donor-driven, as folks would often say. And I think we've learned over many decades of development finance that if the people who are closest to the people on the ground have the ability to decide how the money should be used, that is actually a more sustainable and more effective way to govern. And so the Green Climate, one of the advantages of the Green Climate Fund is that it has a balanced governance structure where developing countries, recipient countries, have as much say as donor governments. And that's a notable contrast to institutions like the World Bank, where donor countries typically have much more power. And then again, another thing I referred to is what's the balance between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Mitigation finance, because it's, I think, easier for donors to get a handle on, and it's much more likely to result in returns on investment. Mitigation finance has dominated the climate finance landscape. Adaptation typically has gotten much less, and the loss and damage conversation is brand new. So there is no loss and damage finance mechanism right now. So big question about how that will be handled, and then about how we fix that broken balance between mitigation and adaptation finance as well. And again, here's where the Green Climate Fund is an improvement over previous funds. That it has a specific policy that it is aiming for a 50-50 balance between mitigation and adaptation finance, and that's something that a policy that doesn't exist in other institutions. So all that to say, the Green Climate Fund there's a reason that it is the primary institution. Many of us in civil society kind of fought for these principles around governance, around accounting, around mitigation adaptation balance. We've made some progress in the Green Climate Fund that make it a better institution than ones that came before. It is definitely not perfect. And it's this sort of an ongoing struggle in that institution to make it what it needs to be, and to increase its capacity so that it can be channeling just the sheer amount of money that is needed to address the problem globally. So these are all kind of ongoing struggles, both at national level and in the international forums. I think this is a good place to hand over to Pontus to talk about some of the work and research that he's done. So I will stop here. I recognize that there are probably a ton of just open questions or questions that I have opened up. So Nils, I don't know if there are some that need to be dealt with now, or if
I think there's a couple that we can pick up now that are just mostly clarifying questions. I think one of the clearest examples is there was a question that was posed: what happens if countries miss payments? Right? Because you have a certain figure, should that get added on? How do you deal with that in your calculations?
Okay. Okay, so sorry, I understood that question as what happens to countries if they miss payments, and of course the answer to that is nothing. There is no real accountability mechanism that's built into to the global climate regime. But the methodological question is that we do update the fair shares analysis every year to account for basically continued inaction. And so each year there's a global coalition that ActionAid is part of that puts out an updated we call it the Civil Society Equity Review, and it's essentially the fair shares analysis globally. And we update it every year with new numbers, because with every year of continued inaction on both emissions reductions and finance, what we have to do grows, obviously. So yeah. It is dynamic in that way.
That makes sense. Then I have at least one more that I want to quickly touch on. And that's the question of how do you decide which countries to actually end up sending this money to?
So this is actually another reason that we have been really focused on the Green Climate Fund as a multilateral institution, right? A lot of climate finance happens bilaterally and will continue happening bilaterally. But what that does is it essentially allows wealthy governments to pick and choose what countries they want to give money to, right? That is not a recipe for a fair climate regime. And the Green Climate Fund, because it has a balanced governance structure, it has a democratic board with equal numbers of developed and developing countries on that board. That board decides how to allocate Green Climate Fund money. And so at least there's a system by which you can make sure that countries get what they need, or if not what they need exactly, that there is a more balanced distribution between countries. Now, as you can imagine, things can get very contentious and political at that board when they're making decisions about who gets how much money. Luckily, we haven't gotten to a point yet where it's been, there hasn't been like an open fight where there are different developing country constituencies fighting over a small pot of money. Thankfully, that hasn't happened yet. But this is, of course, a very difficult and politically fraught question.
Exactly. As things get more extreme, the contentiousness will not dissipate. Exactly. Okay, I think we're gonna jump over to Pontus, and if there's any questions that are left over after that, then I'll make sure that those get answered as we go.
Great.
Thank you very much. Pontus, go right ahead.
Thanks, Nils. Let me know if you see my screen. Oh, I think you should see my screen, right?
Yeah.
Great. So, well, I think Brendan has made my life quite easy, explained a lot of these very difficult concepts, quite difficult to articulate. Like I mentioned in introduction, before joining SIDA, I was working with Nils on issues around climate, and we'd had quite strong focus on climate finance. We'd had several meetings with different policymakers, academics, and other stakeholders in Netherlands, and we've also written this report. And the report that I'm presenting, it specifically looks at Dutch climate finance policy and practice. But I might also maybe expand the discussion a bit to complement some of these trends that Brendan already presented. But to try to give a little bit of structure, well, I'll start to talk a little about financing Netherlands' fair share. I'll then give a brief introduction to Dutch climate finance, different, and I will then move on to bringing in the concept and talking about how Dutch climate finance is aligned to the principles. And I can already mention now that based on our desk review of policy interviews, also quite a great deal of statistical analysis, we have identified several promises and also some potential pitfalls. So in that, I will just say a few things about the fair share, and I'm happy I don't have to go into a calculation. It's difficult to articulate, but we're as remaining carbon budget, the responsibility of the country based on historical emissions, capabilities of the country, and also a country's right to develop. And in this, a country like Netherlands has quite a high burden, and other high-income countries. Just one quite telling statistic is that still today, high and upper middle-income countries account for almost 90% of global CO2 emissions, while the least developed countries, home to about 14% of the global population, only accounts for about 0.5% of emissions. And here also in our report and in many other climate finance reports, when we talk about the responsibility to provide climate finance, we usually refer to the share of the commitment to provide $100 billion as agreed on the Paris Agreement. And while Netherlands' fair share on these factors, it can visualize in the graph that I show here on the right-hand side. Just again to recap, the black line is the baseline or the status quo trajectory, if you prefer. The blue line shows the reduction that would be equivalent to Netherlands' fair share. And then this can be achieved both by reducing national emissions down to the green dotted line, and then financing green transitions abroad, which would be equivalent to the bottom yellow triangle with stripes in there. And you can put this into financial terms. 1.6 billion euros annually be a conservative calculation, but it's at least an indication on an annual basis. Perhaps a more realistic or accurate prediction would be around 20 billion by 2030 for Netherlands. And that might seem quite high, but again, I think it's good to also put it in a bit of perspective. So for example, the EU recently agreed on the COVID recovery budget of about 750 billion. and out of that, Netherlands is eligible for around 6 billion. And I'm not at all trying to say that that's a poorly invested money. It's unsound, but I think there's a strong case that that despite competition for budget allocation, Netherlands' fair share and well beyond the fair share is fully within the fiscal envelope of the government, especially as climate finance is not a cost, it's an investment, and also any upfront costs are substantially outweighed by the long-term gains. So moving on then to how Dutch climate finance looks in practice. To make it a bit easier to overview, because it can be a bit complicated, we can say that it comes from two main streams, and namely public and private sources. Graph from the Paris Agreement, 2016 until today. Well, today the two differences make out about 50% each, and in 2020, the Netherlands provided about 1.1 billion euro in public and private climate finance. I should say also this data comes from the OECD DAC database, which is then the officially reported figures by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But we can also see that there has been a general trend over the past years, more reliance on private finance and less on public finance. We can also say though that well, $1.1 billion, it is below the fair share of 1.6, even the more conservative calculation, but still, Netherlands is relatively speaking, at least, Netherlands is quite a large climate donor, both in absolute terms and even more so when we look at GDP or GNI that is allocated to climate finance. Also, Netherlands makes quite an important contribution to the Green Climate Fund, and also recently to the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, which will provide about 160 million euro for climate-related projects in low-income countries. And as I understand from recent progress reports, they're quite well on track to achieve this, and will also be 50-50 adaptation mitigation. But having said that, it's quite to really understand Dutch climate finance, or at least to make international comparisons relevant, it's important to know that Dutch climate finance is actually counted as part of the country's total official development assistance, ODA. So it's not possible to untangle how much of the finance is actually new and additional, which is another criteria that was set up in the Paris Agreement. Also, when you review the OECD DAC data, you will find that actually only 7% of Dutch ODA goes to projects that address climate change as the principal goal. So the majority goes to other projects that have been modified to address some other relevant climate concern. And in practice, this is actually how much of the international climate finance looks. And also a majority are pure investment projects. But if you're more cynical, you can question if this increasing focus on climate, European ODA and Dutch ODA is a result of a genuine commitment, or if there's relabeling going on, perhaps minor tweaks to also be able to add a climate marker to the allocations. And that's actually beyond our analysis of Dutch climate finance. But I can recommend the Oxfam published a report last year on international climate finance, not specifically in Netherlands. But they draw the conclusion that there indeed is quite a lot of over-reporting going on. I think Brendan was also mentioned some of these issues a little bit. And also there's private, Netherlands has a very high reliance on private finance. It should again be emphasized that there's no standardized methodology how to measure these volumes in mobilized finance. So having introduced Netherlands' fair share climate finance, I'll also bring in the just transition concept into the discussion. And here I think that the concept and the way of thinking has already been presented in previous sessions. So to not repeat, I'll just say that the concept both explains what the new system will look like, and also how that transformation should be carried out. And most importantly, that a just transition must address and not exacerbate inequalities. It needs to ensure inclusiveness and participation, to develop comprehensive policy frameworks, and we also need to transform the system to work for people, nature, the climate. If you have more questions about these principles, maybe we can take it in the end, or maybe Niels can share the definition afterwards. But in terms of climate finance, this largely becomes about shifting the debate from these very technical issues around climate finance, for example, how to mobilize private co-finance, how to count climate finance, to make it more in line with just transition. We need to bring in the focus on how to make sure these investments both protect the environment and human rights. And I will now go through these principles with and provide some examples. And well, as a starting point, just transition needs to understand and address the ways in which a current system is causing individuals and communities to be exploited, squeezed, and displaced. So this, for example, means we need to understand that farmers and workers are understandably worried that they might be penalized for new climate policies and obligations. And I think in general, it's quite fair to say that climate finance actors are often quite good at understanding at the environmental issues, but the human rights-based approach and considerations have been largely lacking. One quite telling statistic is that only about 1.5% of climate-related ODA identifies gender as a primary objective, and only 34% identifies gender as an important but not principal objective. So the majority is not gender screened. And this is quite concerning, as the link between climate and gender is both well documented and absolutely fundamental. Besides the gender element, many climate finance investments are also designed to primarily incentivize private co-finance. And although this in itself is not necessarily against the principles of just transition, and also I think most would agree that beyond will be vital closing the SDG funding gap. These investments do merit quite close examination. So, for example, in our report, we have documented how climate finance, also Dutch climate finance, has been used for bioenergy plantations, and it's not that's quite an investment project. But there is also a large number of documented cases where these driven land grabs, these marginal communities, and so forth, even though they might have some of them might have a positive climate impact. We also know that less than 6% of the blended climate finance, this is the mix of public and private, is directed to the least developed countries. And I'll explain a little bit more about this later in the presentation. But it also highlights the need to monitor if these investments really are reaching those who need the finance the most. When we zoom in on Dutch support to specific adaptation, because it should be said, Netherlands, like Brendan mentioned, adaptation finance has been largely lacking in relation to needs, or particularly lacking. And Netherlands stands out as quite a leader in adaptation finance. But when you look at policy, you see that climate smart agricultural solutions is a strongly articulated policy focus. It's to increase crop yields while also protecting the environment. And indeed, there are many innovations that can be hugely beneficial for both of these objectives. But at the same time, it's a growing concern that the term is increasingly used to greenwash industrial agricultural practices. And here again, there's quite a long list of examples that show how poorly designed climate smart agricultural investments have increased inequalities rather than addressed them. So, for example, in our report, we document flows to synthetic fertilizers, which here the goal is to help farmers adapt to global warming. But in fact, these solutions are also very energy intensive and not release nitrogenous oxide. So a majority of these type of investments are really not accessible for the poorest smallholder farmers, and they might therefore be left even further behind, and especially women. Closely linked to issues around addressing inequality, focus need to carefully consider issues of inclusiveness and participation. And here it's really about basing the program, the needs and participation of the local context. And this has also been a major shortfall for climate finance at large. For example, several evaluations have shown that less than 10% of climate finance is directed to projects. And we've tried, we've not been able to track how much Dutch climate finance is directed to community projects, but it's reasonable to expect that it within the world average. And I should say we have actually it's not able to make, and this is quite a
Pontus?
shortfall in reporting.
Pontus, 1 second.
Yeah.
You went in and out for a second.
Oh.
Your internet stopped for 1 second. It was roughly around the part where you started talking about the 10% of all climate finance investments going to locally led climate change projects.
Sorry about that. I hope it works better now.
It seems so.
Okay, great. Thanks, Niels, for letting me know. So I was just saying that about only 10% of climate finance investments globally is directed to locally led projects. And we have tried to break down how much Dutch is directed to local projects, but we've not been able to. It's quite an important gap in reporting because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs doesn't have these figures. But we have been able to break it down based on income level. So high income country, low income country, middle income country. And Netherlands does direct a relatively high share to the to low income countries, not least through the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development. But this is not necessarily the same as directing funding to locally led projects. And in fact, as we have showed in our report, funding to low-income countries is especially likely to be directed to centralized large-scale projects. And there are several reasons for this. One is that local investments is more risky, for example, due to capacity, the risk of corruption, and they generally incur quite high transaction costs. And this may be true, but the argument is also insufficient, as there is such a large evidence base that the small decentralized projects often have huge impact. And they have very clear advantages for funding local projects and activities. They have greater accountability, direct accountability, and also the sustainability of are identified and delivered by local actors and community members. There's also many innovative program designs that can substantially reduce these risks that we hope that the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs might look more to. So maybe just to mention one, in many countries, ActionAid, other organizations acts as the contractually responsible part to the donor. And then, for example, ActionAid can be able to sub-grant funding to community-led projects that otherwise never be able to access finance. In Zambia, for instance, there is such a scheme that has allowed women groups to access funding and to design and implement their own adaptation projects. And in several other countries, mechanisms that connect community projects with this different existing local government infrastructure have significantly improved both local resilience and participation. A second challenge for community projects to access finance is that most climate funds, and to an extent also the Green Climate Fund, even though it's better than many others, they primarily judge grants on the ability to mobilize private co-finance and reduce emissions. And all of this incentivizes large-scale energy investments. And especially in low-income countries, private investors will not co-finance community projects because of issues like high interest rates, uncommercially viable insurances, and not to mention other political risks. So to improve local participation, it will also be important to make local climate investments more viable. And this is especially relevant for Netherlands, as such a large share comes from private sources, like we saw earlier, more than 50% or just around 50%. And that's also a broad issue. It involves strengthening good governance, reducing corruption, but there are also several very immediate policy tools that is available. So, for example, providing guarantees to investors, or supporting with assessing credit risks. And in our report, we do identify the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development as a quite promising modality to make local investments more viable, as it combines grants, technical assistance, with also concessional finance, which is essentially loans offered with terms much more generous than market loans to incentivize investment. And well, I'm realizing, sorry, I'm running a little bit out of time, but as a final slide, I'll maybe just like to zoom out a little bit from the more technical aspects of climate finance to also look at the broader system which the particular transition needs to take place. Because, well, perhaps stating the obvious, this type of change is multisectoral and will only be efficient and effective if it is coordinated with other sectors and policies. And when you put it that way, it's also very clear that it will be immensely expensive. And in fact, often the debate, the discussion nearly ends there. And I want coming back a little bit to where I started the presentation around about if these are fiscally sound investments. But it's important to remember that when we talk about increasing the volume of climate finance, it's not only about finding additional resources, but it's as important, perhaps more important, to look at how to strategically allocate the existing funds. So, for example, in our report, we've highlighted the Dutch support to synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, chemical inputs, and also fossil fuels. So, again, over the period since the Paris Agreement, the Netherlands has provided about 4.9 billion euros in fossil fuel subsidies each year. And when you sum up all Dutch financial support to the fossil fuel industry, it amounts to an average of 8.3 billion euro per year. And again, just to put that into a little bit of perspective, as we show in our report, Netherlands has provided about 593 euro per year in public climate finance. And well, the annual average ODA has been at around 4.7 billion euro. So that's just one example of how huge volumes of additional finance could be mobilized by strategically reallocating public funding. And of course, in the case of fossil fuel subsidies, by ending these, we would both free up finance and we would substantially increase the impact of the existing climate finance. And maybe just to end, like Netherlands has made quite strong, clear commitments to divest from fossil fuels, and there seems to be political will. FMO's recent position statement on divesting is also very encouraging. But so far, the political will has been lacking. So I think going forward, it will be very important to monitor these commitments and make sure that there is accountability in implementation. And while I tried to cover quite a lot in a short time, I apologize for that. Many of these terms are quite technical, but I've included also some readings that can be interested if you want to learn more about Dutch climate finance, look at the statistics, and in our report we also elaborate on all of these different topics and give more examples of how it looks in the Netherlands. So well, thanks for listening. I hope my network wasn't too bad.
No, I think apart from that one little moment, it was all very clear. Thank you very much, Pontus. I'm just having a look if there are any follow-up questions. Otherwise, I still have a couple here and there. If people want to pose their questions directly to our panelists, they can also choose to raise their hands, and then I could allow you to talk. If you do, and I do give you the mic, please limit any follow-up questions to very short single follow-up questions so that we don't have extensively long conversations. One question that we do have is, and I don't know if either of you have touched on this before, is the possibility of corruption relating to climate finance, and if there are any safeguards for that, for example, in the Green Climate Fund. I don't know, Brandon, if that's something that's come up at the higher levels, for example.
Yeah, sure, I can take that. I mean, it certainly has. I think corruption, as probably all of you know, is sort of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it is a very real problem in many places. And a lot of our work is dedicated towards making sure money goes where it needs to go. On the other hand, it is often used as an excuse in wealthy countries to either not provide finance at all, or to put really, really stringent and onerous reporting requirements on finance, or to to justify a donor-driven model. And so I think we have to be very careful about this issue. The Green Climate Fund certainly does have quite a number of safeguards in place. So the Green Climate Fund works through what are called accredited entities, and ideally those are in-country institutions, whether they're government institutions or they could be large NGOs, and I think I saw a question related to that. They could be local governments. They can also be international entities like multilateral development banks, but those entities are responsible for kind of oversight in a sense of how the money is being spent. And they have to go through a very, very rigorous accreditation process to make sure that they have the kind of fiscal management policies in place, to make sure they have a gender policy, among many other things, right? And many have said actually that accreditation process is overly difficult and overly stringent. But that one of the purposes of that is to reduce the possibility of corruption. I will say that from a civil society side, someone sitting in my position doing advocacy at the Green Climate Fund board or doing advocacy with the US government is primarily concerned with getting the money to flow and with trusting people and communities and institutions in developing countries to do what they believe to be best with that money. On the other hand, we do have colleagues in ActionAid and many other organizations based in recipient countries who are doing that accountability and monitoring work, right? And so I think that work is absolutely crucial, but it is much better done by people and institutions and organizations in recipient countries rather than trying to impose it from people in donor countries.
Yeah, I think that kind of touches on what Anne was asking as well, whether there's examples of these coming together. And I can say, at least from the Dutch example, that the issues of good governance, the issues of anti-corruption and climate finance, that's part of the reason why they want in the Netherlands to keep it within the ODA framework, because they already have certain established measures for those issues. But that we run into the same problem, and that's also one of the reasons it's so difficult to get it to local communities, is because then there's a massive administrative load being put on these on people who are asking for these funds, that often the smaller CBOs, community-based organizations, aren't able to live up to. So that is a recurring problem. I have a question for Pontus. I think it kind of sounds similar, but it's different, I think. Can you clarify a bit on why we'd be keen to make sure a certain portion of the climate finance comes from the ODA envelope? Doesn't that undermine other humanitarian and development finance? So Pontus, maybe you can clarify on that.
Well, what I can say, so about the new and additional component of the Paris Agreement, that is something that is quite debated in general, and it should also different donors do very differently with how they count climate finance. That also makes these international comparisons quite quite difficult. So, for example, Netherlands counts climate finance as part of the ODA, while other countries don't do it. And I mean, one challenge with having it as part of the ODA, or a potential risk, is that there might be a higher risk of relabeling other development flows that maybe was originally designed to go to WASH or to some other area of development assistance, is then slightly modified to also include a climate marker. And in the case of Netherlands, they can then report on it as part of the climate finance. But we actually did address this with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs in meetings, and this is something that that we discuss a lot internally. But their motivation to keep climate finance as part of the ODA is because, of course, for them it's always a competition for budget allocation between the different sectors of development cooperation and also broader. So for them, they were arguing it's actually more difficult for them to access to increase finance if it has to be additional beyond ODA. But it's definitely it makes it more difficult to track.
Yeah, I think maybe to add to that as well, indeed, when we had these internal discussions with the ministry, it does, we make the argument at some point that the current way that it's structured in Holland has taken away from some of the other elements of that are supposed to come out of the ODA budget, right? As climate finance has increased, we've seen the ODA budget either slightly decrease or stabilize in that period, meaning that there's just simply less money for other things. So when we say that it might be useful to keep it within the ODA framework, we don't mean from the same bucket of money. We mean add more money that we know is for climate finance, but the framework in terms of distributing it can be used. It's a bit of a technical discussion to be having with the ministry, but what we've seen is that, or at least that what their experience is, that it's easier for them to get it to the least developed countries. It's easier for them to get it to communities that really, really need it within that framework than if we removed it out of that framework and designed a whole new system for it. And they're also a little bit afraid that then that the public finance part goes away entirely and really becomes just blended finance. So there's a difficult balance there. And we also obviously have the question as to whether or not, to what degree that's accurate, and whether those predictions are accurate. So there's a discussion to be had there. I had a question for you, Brendan, when you brought up the graph showing how much climate finance the US needs to bring up, right? There was the blue side and the red side. The red side is how much they need to decrease emissions themselves. The blue side is how much they need to achieve outside of that. Is that just mitigation, or does that also then cover adaptation and loss and damage?
It is mitigation only. So I actually still have this up. Let me share it. So yeah, the fair shares analysis is mitigation centric, because mitigation is the easiest thing to quantify. And so, yeah, I mean, what it shows is emissions, right? And so we have to get from the dotted black line to the blue line. That is our emissions gap, right? And so the blue thing is what we have to cover with finance. And so we finance those emissions reductions in other countries. And so that's mitigation only. So whatever dollar figure we come up with to cover that blue section has to be augmented with additional finance for adaptation and for loss of damage. I mean, they're all big numbers, right?
Yeah, no, it amounts to a staggering amount of money. But we have also seen, I think it's valuable to add, we've also seen how much it costs when we don't do this. For us in the Netherlands, we've seen with the recent floods how much that has cost and how quickly we were suddenly able to mobilize financing for those both individuals and enterprises that were essentially put underwater, right? And that got destroyed. But
and if I can jump in, I mean, I think that latter piece is really important, right? I think we saw from the response in northern countries to the COVID crisis that if we as a society decide that there is a problem that really urgently needs addressing, we can come up with the money, right? I mean, in the United States, you know, where, you know, government action and the public good is constantly under attack here, we nevertheless managed to come up with trillions of dollars in response to multiple crises over the last few years. And then on the flip side, we're also putting an unbelievable amount of money into non-socially productive things, right? So I mentioned the Department of Defense budget briefly in passing. Well, it turns out that under President Biden's latest budget request, they're asking for almost $750 billion for the Department of Defense for the next fiscal year, right? And so that really puts into context the fact that we're asking for $800 billion in climate finance for the entire developing world from now until 2030, right? It doesn't sound like such a crazy amount when you put it into context.
very clear. I have no more questions. I think I don't see any more questions. So I think with that, I think it's very good it's a good spot to end the webinar side of this. So I'm going to end the recording in a minute. And for those of you who are part of the Climate Summer School larger program, you guys know the drill by now. We're going to be transferring over to Teams, and we're going to have a little chat with Brennan and Pontus over there. If anyone has any questions, wants to do some extra reading, make sure you go to either the ActionAid International website, or you go to the ActionAid Netherlands website, or also the ActionAid US website, and you'll find plenty of stuff. And there's also some excellent reading material with the Civil Society Review that's also done some excellent work on loss and damage. And if you do have any follow-ups, make sure you you reach out to us. We're fairly easy to access. In any case, I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and we're going to be transferring over to Teams now. Cheers.